Why, hello, my little darlings. I'm Carmen Dark, and welcome to Tormented Tales, where, as you probably know, we share stories sent in by our viewers that are both truly terrifying and terrifyingly true. Tonight's violent delights came to us over the space of 6 months. Having gotten one account from someone working in crime scene investigation, we shelved the story, thinking it might be a long time before we got another from someone in the same profession. Luckily, though, just such a story arrived recently, and so now we have 2 true tales from the world of forensics to share. Our first story comes from Marie in the US and concerns a rather gruesome bit of fraud and the even more terrifying consequences. Rule of thumb. Usually, when we're called to a location to do a forensic analysis and scene sweep, it's the body of the victim that is the main focus. Whilst there are many environmental factors to be taken into account when determining the cause of death, and various other lines of expertise that may need to be brought in, for example, ballistic experts if the cause of death relates to a firearm, in most cases, the majority of the evidence, and therefore the bulk of our attention, centers around the body itself. In this particular case, the focus was a little different. We were called to the apartment originally by a neighbor who had complained about the smell. Usually this is an indication that any corpse we might encounter is likely to be far from fresh. If you'll pardon the pun, it's a dead giveaway. The fact that the victim had been dead for well over a week in this case was a huge disappointment, because it meant that a potential source of key evidence, fingerprints, lifted from the surface of the skin, was ruled out. This was particularly upsetting as it might have proved more than just who committed the crime. Now, you might think that entire idea of prints from skin sounds absurd. How can you get a fingerprint from the skin's surface itself? Well, I'm here to tell you, as someone who has worked in forensics for almost 17 years, it is more than possible if taken within a certain time frame. Without boring you with a ton of technical jargon, you can take fingerprints from human skin using powders like magnetic silver and Swedish black. On living skin, they will show up for up to 15 minutes after the contact is made. Substances like cyanoalkylate, which we call Ca, and ruthenium tetroxide, which we call RTX, are used, and sometimes have positive results. What this means is that if you touch or grip someone before you kill them, in all likelihood, if we get to that body quickly, we can lift a fingerprint from it. So, for example, if there was some kind of brawl at a bar during which one person was killed and the culprit ran away, if we arrive in good time, we can get fingerprints to go along with other evidence like hair and skin samples. In this particular case, those techniques were of no use because the body was deceased for some time, which, considering the circumstances of the death, was a huge shame. Approaching the apartment that evening, and considering the fact that a bad smell had been reported, I was fully expecting to be met with some serious unpleasantness. What I did meet, however, was far more gruesome than I'd imagined. In the center of the living room, lying on his back and naked except for a pair of boxer shorts and a stained vest, was a man of around 50 years of age who had clearly been dead for some time. In terms of a cause of death, the bruises around his neck and collarbone, not to mention the partial collapse of his trachea, seemed to suggest that he had been strangled to death by someone with considerable strength. This, however, was not all that we found. Whilst the bedroom and kitchen of the apartment were fairly normal, the spare room was anything but. Stepping inside, myself and my fellow investigators were hit with a smell far more potent than in the living room. The reason was immediately clear. Dangling from the ceiling of this room were hundreds of individual fishing lines, spaced a few inches apart. On the end of each of these fishing lines was a thumb. These digits were in various stages of decomposition. Some were quite fresh, whilst others were little more than cylinders of mush. Where the thumbs had come from and why the owner of the apartment was keeping them was a mystery. Until one of the other members of the ops team managed to access his computer a few days later. It seemed that the victim, whose name I cannot share, had access to over 135 different bank accounts held in 16 different countries. In every case, the account had been set up online using a mobile phone and a process through which the account and phone itself could be accessed using fingerprint recognition. The victim had set up these accounts remotely online using fake names and details. Then, when the time came for identification, he chose to do it through thumbprint recognition. He would then go through the grisly process of placing one of the many severed thumbs he kept in the back room onto the screen of the phone, which would then read the print and grant him access. Each thumb was labeled and corresponded to one of over 200 phones and to one of the many bank accounts. The victim then borrowed huge amounts of money, running up overdrafts in each account and then simply refusing to pay it back, prompting the bank to chase a customer who did not exist. A ghost. Possibly literally. Where had the victim found these many appendages? Well, it turned out his other job beyond this mass fraud was as a mortician at a local funeral service. Evidently, he would make up the body for any open casket proceedings, but ensure that the hands were never visible during the ceremonies. Then before the casket was finally closed, he took a thumb, clipping it off with shears. He then took the thumbs home and used them to set up accounts. Whilst this in itself is gruesome enough, what was most intriguing about this case was not, as you might expect, the room of thumbs. Rather, it was the bruises on the victim's neck. He had been strangled to death in a room locked from the inside. There was no way the perpetrator could have escaped after the act and still locked and bolted the door. Not only that, but the impressions made by the hands that strangled the victim showed a curious detail. The hands that did it had only 4 fingers. If only we could have lifted prints, we might have been able to prove that the victim was dispatched by someone long dead, whose thumb was now hanging from a thread in the back room. As it was, we could prove no such thing, and the case remains unsolved. Now, don't be getting any ideas, kiddies. The police are wise to these games now. No point trying to copy, so you might as well put the shears away. Our next story was sent in by Teresa from England, who also works in CSI. I would advise anyone who has kids or smaller siblings to pay close attention, and to absolutely not go onto YouTube after this to see how slender snakes somehow managed to swallow their huge prey whole. The Carcass. It isn't often that a CSI team is followed to the scene and prevented from leaving by representatives from the government. It is even less often the case that those CSI officers are forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. And rarer still that the evidence they have been examining vanishes without a trace, as if the entire investigation never took place. It isn't often, but it does happen sometimes. I know because it happened to me. Now, of course, I cannot say what I saw in any mass public forum or media outlet without being in fear of my job and possibly my life. At the same time, I can't just sit on what I saw and pretend it never happened. So I'm submitting here to a channel that airs true tales. Here, people are free to decide whether they believe me or not, and it's unlikely that the authorities will ever trace the story back to me or even bother. After all, a story shared here has plausible deniability. They can say it's an invention, a fiction invented for entertainment purposes. It isn't. This story is neither fiction nor an invention. It's a warning. On the 23rd of October last year, my team and I were called to what looked like to be a perfectly normal house in the suburbs. Unusually for this kind of operation, we were not given any details before we arrived, and I was literally making a note of the presiding officer's name with the intention of complaining about that, when I noticed there were people from another agency crowding outside of the scene. I remember turning to a colleague and raising an eyebrow at that. Whatever had gone on in this house was clearly serious. Ascending the stairs toward what looked like to be a child's bedroom, I was given a briefing that really lived up to its name, in the sense that it was extremely brief. The overriding details were that the homeowner had shot and killed an intruder who had entered the home and attempted to kidnap his son. As we got to the top of the landing, I remembered remarking that the father, who had already been whisked away along with the son by the police, would probably get off with it no matter what we found in the room. Worst case scenario, he gets charged with manslaughter. But if it happened how he says, then I doubt he'll be convicted. Either way, it's not murder. Manslaughter. I remember the presiding officer paused for a long time, avoiding eye contact before responding. I wouldn't be too sure, he said, about the man part. I stepped into the room and instantly saw what the officer was getting at. Whatever it was, lying on the floor in that room, a man it certainly was not. It had the shape of a person, fair enough. It looked in some ways like an old man whose skin, an awful off-pink color like it was made of latex, hung off the bones all loose and wrinkled. Then there were the hands. Its fingers, far too long, were pointed and curved at the end. Not nails or talons. The thing had neither. Rather, the skin and bone itself simply sharpened, formed into a hardened point the way a rhino's horn sprouts from its nose. You got the impression that with any of those murderous fingers, the man on the ground could easily have pierced skin, or grabbed and pulled a child any way it wanted. Then there was the mouth, lipless. It hung open wide. Around it, fold upon fold of skin in the neck, stacked like an accordion, was layered up, the width of the neck and throat seeming, somehow, far too wide. The mouth itself was filled with teeth, similar to those in the mouth of any human being, except for their number. There were hundreds, row upon row, stretching back into the throat and down, disappearing into the thing's pink and silky gullet. The first thing I did was attempt to test a theory about that mouth. Using a metal instrument, I lifted the lower jaw that had been hanging slackly below. As I suspected, it rolled and swam, lolling from side to side beneath the skin. The lower jaw was detached, unhinged from the top. It was the same mechanism used by snakes that swallow eggs and prey many times larger than the size of their own heads. They unhinge their jaws and allow the victim to slide into their throats, which are highly elastic and expand to accommodate the food. That, I thought, would explain the flaps of skin around the neck. This thing's throat expands as it eats. Suddenly, the realization hit me. A glimpse into what had occurred here, and what this thing lying before me probably fed on most of the time. Allowing my eyes to travel over its naked body, I saw the stomach, swollen and bloated, rounded like the thing had swallowed an enormous beach ball. Even then, I knew that when we finally cut that stomach open, we would find the bones of children inside. Moving back toward the door, where the presiding officer was waiting, he having refused to come into the room again, I asked how he knew that the thing had been killed by a gunshot. The officer looked confused. You mean apart from the huge gunshot wound right through the middle of that damn thing? He said, pushing back the door to look again at the strange carcass. After a single glimpse, he barged back into the room, pointing with disbelief at the fleshy pale pile of loose skin and sinew. There, he shouted. Right there! It had a hole in its upper body right there, but it's not there now. I'm sure most people listening to this story will already have dismissed my words as nonsense, lies, or imagination. But for those who have stuck with me, believe this. I have never been as frightened in my entire life as when I saw the corpse of that thing suddenly start to smile. In a furious panic, I grabbed the officer and my colleague and dragged them back toward the entrance. Leaving the scene as quickly as possible, I slammed the door behind me and propped a nearby chair under the handle to prevent it from opening. The homeowner had heard his son's screams from downstairs. He had come up, armed, and shot whatever it was that had his son in its jaws. Hours later, the gunshot wound had healed, and the thing he thought he'd killed was smiling sweetly to itself and at us. After that, the government took over. Multiple men with multiple guns charged past me and into the room. There was the sound of gunfire, which might have reassured me, had there not also been the sound of laughter. I signed my NDA, swore that I would tell nobody what I'd seen, and never asked anyone on the force about the incident again. Whether the thing was killed and taken away for study, I don't know. Nor do I know if the officials who swore us to secrecy already knew that such a thing existed. What I do know is that now, when my little boy screams asking me to check for the boogeyman beneath his bed, I do check. I check very carefully indeed. And there you have it, my little sweetie pies. That's all for tonight's episode. But do make sure you like and subscribe so you're here for our next installment. Until then, good night, sleep tight, and don't let the bed bugs bite. Sweet dreams.